years before I was born. Yeah, I don't think you're getting it, and it's not because I'm disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm taking that as a starting point. We know that. Don't diagnose people. That's fucked up. I have said that internet conversations come down to psychology, and even then, I just start talking about psychological aspects. And I try not to actually create a diagnosis, though. I make statements that could be called a diagnosis. But this situation is different. I mean, first of all, I would love to go into this, and I was writing a bullet points for a video on it, my basic, philosophy. But the breakdown is, first of all, it's not a hard science. I think that psychology is at the, giving leeches, where it's like, okay, using leeches to cure people, not a good idea, but at least they knew, hey, maybe the blood's involved. Yeah, let's do something with the blood. Okay, what? Leeches, and that's kind of where they are psychologically. So, like Mel had pointed out that people can be diagnosed with more than one thing. She doesn't think that BPD, it looks similar at all to the delusions involved in gang stalking. The reason I think it is because it's like the BPDs are the kind of person that if two people are having a conversation, they can think it's about them. And this is very close to what's happening with the gang stalking. Not everybody has voice to skull, where it's obviously there's schizophrenic aspects, and like Mel said, people can have multiple diagnoses. And the thing is, they haven't really figured out how to categorize mental ways of thinking. If everybody is crazy to a certain degree and has personality disorders, then it's another way of saying, well, disorder, schmisnorder. It's it's a tendency to give you some flaws and give you some strengths. We don't really understand those and how they're actually related. So I see some emotional relationships, but then again, I'm not saying this from a point of authority. I'm not diagnosing, here's what you have, now you know, and you're in a cubby hole. No, I'm trying to understand, right? You understand? I'm trying to understand, and I'm using the gang stalking example because obviously if you watch something like that, there's some sort of delusion going on. The understanding is going to have to involve that the person you're talking to is in a particular mental state. It can't just be about the information of like, have they proven that there's voice to skull? I mean, you have to take into account the criteria for proof and things. So, in order to be understanding, if it's that severe, you have to do a little bit of diagnosis. Now, the funny thing about personality disorders and other mental diagnoses is, there's a lot of this, what Composer would call magical thinking. The black and white thinking goes with that, but hand in hand, but they are different. There's a distinction there. So if you're talking to somebody who believes in young earth creationism, you might have to do this diagnosis and be more sympathetic, and then maybe people can't just make a ponage video because they're like, geez, I'm talking to somebody that's, insane. And then maybe you're talking to Together for Peace, and you're like, well, he's not actually showing signs of insanity, he's just agreeing with something I find irrational. And yet in some microcosm, are you going to pwn him either, or are you going to go, look, here's where your brain is not working? In other words, if we're mostly all functional people, which is questionable, that doesn't mean that we're not spiking with what could be considered personality disorders, but since that happens once a month, we are still functional. It doesn't dysfunction our life, but we're still being dysfunctional for those, hours once a month that it affects us. And I really think that's what we're dealing with. Most people are like that, And in terms of diagnosing somebody, even if it was trying to say, well, here's your problem, I understand it, you should get help for this particular thing. I don't think it's, I know there's a stigma and people want it to mean something negative, but when people call me weird or treated me crazy, and yes, they have, very much so, like, thinking I had a diagnosable disorder. I'm not talking about online, I'm talking about real life. Yeah, they're trying to cast aspersion on me, but normal people, so-called normal people, look at the fucking world that they've created. Look at the fucking presidents they re-elect. It is a fucking honor to be called crazy, considering what passes for sanity and sensibility. We argue, should we have the war in Iraq? We don't argue, should we clean up the water in Africa.